Live now to Father Frank Brennan for his thoughts on this case, a momentous case in the life of the Catholic Church in this country, Father Frank. And I want to start by just reading a line in your piece in The Australian today. You said, "Those who neither canonise nor despise Pell should be grateful the High Court has delivered justice according to law in this protracted saga." Can you elaborate on that for our viewers this afternoon?
Yes, Kieran. I think in Australian society there are basically three groups of people when it comes to Cardinal Pell. There are those who revile him, and it wouldn't matter what any court said, it wouldn't change their opinion. There are those who think he's absolutely wonderful and idolise or canonise him, and it wouldn't matter what any court said, that wouldn't change their view. But then I think there's the vast majority of Australians who say, well, we want the processes of the law to work themselves through if there is an allegation which is made against someone of his standing. And I think that's precisely what the High Court has done. The tragedy in this case, Kieran, is that the policing that was done by the Victoria Police in this particular case was very shoddy. The supervision of the brief by the Director of Public Prosecutions of Victoria was shoddy. The way the Director of Public Prosecutions conducted itself, particularly in the High Court, was appalling. And so what we've had is a situation where it's been very difficult for people to get a ready resolution of matters. The other thing, Kieran, in relation to the Victorian legal system, is it's very clear. This decision should have been reached by the Victorian Court of Appeal a year ago. On that court, which held 2-1 against Pell, the one dissentient was Mark Weinberg, who indisputably is the leading criminal appeal judge of the country. And the two in the majority who gave a judgment adverse to Pell suffice to say that all 7 of the High Court judges have basically indicated that their judgment was dreadful.
So in that context, can you explain for those non-lawyers of us, when you read that High Court judgment, it basically made it clear that they accepted the complainant's evidence as credible on the basis of the jury's findings on that it was a credible witness.
Sure.
Now,
sure.
In that sense, how does that equate with a 7-0 judgment of the full bench?
Quite easily, actually, and I've always thought this is a very simple case, Kieran. So what the 7 High Court judges have said is this. Look, when it comes to this complainant, we accept that the jury must have thought that he was credible and reliable. That means that you treat his evidence and you assess it without in any way saying, oh, maybe he was telling a fib or whatever. But as in any case, where you've got 23 witnesses, as you had in this case, well, guess what? Of the other witnesses, most of them were also found to be very honest and credible, and they gave evidence about things where they had no skin in the game. They were simply offering recollections of what they would do during a service after Mass in the cathedral. See, what the lay people have to remember about the legal processes in this case, Kieran, is the trials were conducted under suppression orders, which meant that we ordinary mortals, we didn't have access to what was going on in the court day to day. So in the end, all we got was the verdict that said he was guilty. And so it was only when the cases came before the appeal courts where the first time members of the public could be looking at what was said as to what actually occurred. And in this case, we know, and I feel very deeply for the complainant in this case, because I think the lesson to be learnt is it was the stuff-ups by the police and the DPP which meant that this individual had to spend 4 years of his life undergoing additional trauma where his credible story could have been checked out by the police if they'd done their job. Because back in October 2016, you had 3 Victorian police, including, God help us, the Deputy Commissioner of Police, who flew to Rome in order that Pell be interviewed. Pell had been told, oh well, this is in relation to after choir around the cathedral. It was only during the record of interview that it was made clear to Pell that it was alleged that this occurred after Sunday Mass. Pell then in October 2016 said to them, well, that's impossible, because in the sacristy after 11 a.m. Mass there would be altar servers, there'd be the sacristan, there'd be the assistant sacristan, there'd be the people who come in who've collected the money, and there'd be concelebrating priests. He said, go back to Australia and check all that out. Well, guess what? The police never interviewed one altar server. The police never identified one concelebrating priest. The police never sought out one money collector. These are the ordinary, decent Australians. Yes, they happen to be Catholic, but they'd be just doing what they always do on a Sunday after Mass. So this was the problem, Kieran, that what we had was a case where, yes, the prosecutor did his best to find the 5 or 6 minutes in the sacristy where he could get rid of the master of ceremonies, get rid of the altar servers, get rid of the money collectors, get rid of the concelebrants, but they just couldn't find the 5 or 6 minutes. And then, God help us, in the High Court of Australia, the Director of Public Prosecutions in person, before the bench, basically created a story and created evidence to suggest that it was possible that these altar servers disappeared for 5 or 6 minutes into a room next door. Now, the critical thing, Kieran, is that that had been put by the prosecutor to the jury at the trial, but when he was asked to withdraw that by the judge quite properly because there was no evidence of it, he did it. And guess what happened in the High Court of Australia? The Director of Public Prosecutions, with the QC sitting beside her, who had argued the cases before the jury, she just threw him under the bus and said, oh, he shouldn't have made that concession. And then she invented a piece of evidence as if to justify what was now being put as the argument. Now, of course, the High Court, all 7 of them, you could see on their faces that this was just absolutely preposterous. And that's been the problem with this case, Kieran. Sure, there's all the ABC commentary about it out there, but if you actually look at the evidence, and if you actually look at the conduct of the police, and if you actually look at the conduct of the DPP, those who are serious about the well-being of victims and bona fide complainants would be saying, come on, we need better from the Victorian Police than this, we need better from the DPP than this, and we definitely deserve better from the Chief Justice and the President of the Court of Appeal of Victoria. Otherwise, what we get is years of this sort of trauma in the community generally, to say nothing of someone like Pell being put in jail for 404 days, where he's in lockdown in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day on a case which clearly should never have been brought in the first case.
Cardinal Pell said that it was not a referendum on the Catholic Church, his case, in his statement, but fundamentally, do you think that he was held responsible, given your analysis of the case and the stumbles by the various levels of the law, whether it be the police or the DPP, given your view on that, do you think that he was held basically accountable, being the most senior Catholic in the country, for the other sins of the Catholic Church in this case?
That's a possibility, Kieran, but I don't know. None of us knows, because we're not in the minds of the jury. See, the way the criminal justice system works is the High Court of Australia quite properly, unanimously has said that no rational jury could have been convinced beyond reasonable doubt that what was alleged actually occurred. Now, that conclusion should have been simply reached by all 3 judges of the Court of Appeal of Victoria. Now, what led the jury into such error in this particular case, we don't know. My own hunch, and it's only a hunch, but I sat there during some of the first and second trials, my hunch was, I think it was the second trial was 2 weeks after Prime Minister Morrison had given his speech in the Parliament, where he made the national apology to those who were victims, and he said, we believe you. So I think that was there in the mind of the jury. Well, what does it mean to say we believe you, other than to convict, regardless of whatever conflicts there might be in evidence? I think that was a factor. My own hunch has always been that a big factor was that Pell himself did not give evidence, and I suspect that a lot of the jurors sat there looking at a defence barrister like Richter, who had a fearsome reputation, cross-examining the complainant, I think for over a day, but then Pell just sitting there silent. And I suspect that some of the jurors thought, we're sick of the Catholic Church having money available to employ flash lawyers, and they then just sit there silent, and we're going to slot him. Now, that's only speculation on my part, but that was the hunch that I had as I sat through some of the proceedings.
Now, as you've said, and you've written that you think that this was an avoidable trauma for witness J as well in this matter, but
absolutely,
when you look at the whole
what he's been put through has been hell.
Sure. Yeah. Well, no, you reflect on that for our viewers, and also in the context of the countless other victims who, I was at the appeals court. I saw outside the Supreme Court of Victoria the tears from many survivors who had a lot invested in this case.
Sure. Yeah, for them it was emblematic. But let's think about the complainant, Mr. J. I mean, I wasn't at the committal proceedings, but we've got the book by, what's her name, Lucy Marr, and she says that the evidence that was given at the committal was that, I think it was back in 2014, that this boy's mother, or I suppose he was a young man by then, that the mother had contacted an organisation called Broken Rights and reported she was worried about her son because he'd been abused by a parish priest in a parish somewhere else some years before. And then it was 6 months later that the mother made contact again to make mention about St Patrick's Cathedral, and then the name Pell came up. Now, when you've got a situation like that, it does require very critical and sensitive Victorian police work. I give full marks to the Victorian Police for accompanying victims and complainants on their journeys on these things, but where I'm very critical of them is that I think they have done a great disservice to this complainant, because basically they then disengaged in doing just the ordinary detective work. If I could give one example, Kieran. When the police flew to Rome with the Deputy Commissioner of Police, Shane Patton, and he's got his name in the ring there to replace Mr Ashton when he goes later in the year, so this is very deep in the Victorian Police Force, their commitment to this case. When they got to Rome, they had put to Pell that the procession that took place after Mass was basically an internal procession where the boys were just walking along the corridor near the sacristy, and then they went and started poking around. Now, that would have made some sense. It was Pell who pointed out and said, well, hang on, no, we didn't do that. We used to have an external procession, a long procession right around the cathedral. And so when they went back to Australia, they presumably did some detective work about that, but not very much. So it wasn't until the committal proceeding that Richter actually asked the complainant about how it was that he travelled into the sacristy, where he then described a very elaborate route, which, guess what, would have taken 5 minutes from the end of Mass for the boys to get into the sacristy. Well, the case had been built on the basis that there was 5 or 6 minutes in which this could have happened. Well, 5 minutes had disappeared. Now, that sort of basic police work, you know, you don't have to be much more than Inspector Clouseau to do the work on that, and to go back to a complainant and say, hang on, there are basic things, it's not that we don't believe you, but there are basic things here about your story which don't add up, and we've got to get it better. That was never done.
Cardinal Pell is a polarising figure, and as you
he certainly
point
is.
Out, whether you,
I've had my fights with him for years.
I know you have. I know you have. But if you like him or you detest the individual concerned, how do you reflect on the?
But that's precisely
case right now.
Well, the way I reflect on that. That's what the rule of law is about, Kieran. It's about living in a country where you can proudly say, it doesn't matter whether you're a Cardinal Pell, it doesn't matter whether you're an Aboriginal person out of sorts, out back of Burke, whoever you are, that you get justice according to law. And we have breached that principle very fundamentally in this case until we got to the High Court of Australia. And so I say all praise to the highest court in the land, and I think the behaviour of the senior judiciary, of the Director of Public Prosecutions and of the Deputy Police Commissioner in Victoria, I think it's been absolutely below par, and I think it has meant that the rule of law has not been extended without fear or favour. And that's why someone like myself, sure, I've had all sorts of fights with Cardinal Pell in the past, and I'll probably have some more in the future. They'll be about esoteric theological points in the Catholic Church which won't need to worry your viewers. But I couldn't care whether I like him or dislike him, whether his theology is the same as mine or not. If a prominent citizen like that is going to be targeted by the police, by the DPP, and then given second-rate treatment by an appeal court, I say I've got a job to do to be out there and say the rule of law should apply to everyone, including one George Pell, even though he's a cardinal of the Catholic Church.
And finally, there is a call now for the Attorney-General. It's a separate issue. It's not in relation to this matter. It's a separate matter going back to when he was a priest in Ballarat in the 70s and 80s about the Royal Commission. A lot of it was redacted. Do you think that that should be released now in terms of the references to Cardinal Pell?
I think, in principle, everything in a Royal Commission report should be unredacted as soon as all criminal processes have been played through. Now, in relation to Pell, I would say this. Given the abysmal behaviour of the Director of Public Prosecutions in relation to Pell in particular, given that she did not follow her own protocol in the way she conducted herself in the High Court, I would say this, that if there is to be a suggestion that Pell be prosecuted again on an offence, no matter how historic or whatever, 3 points to make. First, it not be the police but the DPP that discharged that function. We had too much Mickey Mouse stuff going on with this case in the first instance, with the police going ahead and saying that he'd be charged, and it was just a media farce. That's got to be the job of the DPP. Second, the DPP should be required to show that they apply the principles of their protocol. And thirdly, I would say in this particular instance, that the DPP should have the humility to accept, given her demonstrable failures in this case, that it is essential, if there be consideration of the prosecution of Pell of any other historic offence, that the brief simply be handed to a reputable retired judge or a reputable QC at the private bar, not part of the coterie of the DPP, to give a learned opinion whether, according to the DPP's own protocol, whether or not a prosecution is warranted. That prosecution should then proceed. But then, if, as I suspect, there would be no basis for any further prosecutions, then once that's done and dusted, yes, everything in the Royal Commission report should be unredacted, and anything there that's adverse to Pell, let's see it. Anything adverse to anybody else. What we want out of that Royal Commission is transparency and justice for everyone, and that's what our Catholic Church has needed. We needed a Royal Commission to be able to do it, but to have the fruit of the Royal Commission being messed up and the lives of complainants being destroyed because the police in Victoria have not done their job, I just think we've got to call a stop to that once and for all.
Father Frank Brennan, I appreciate your time. As always, thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Good to be with you. And let's, above all, spare our thoughts for Mr. J. He gave a very moving statement there yesterday about getting on with his life, but knowing that there are dark periods. And my regret is those dark periods, sure, in the first instance, they came because of some dreadful priest who abused him out in the suburbs or whatever, and I am a Catholic priest and I have to bear some responsibility for that. But to think it's been compounded by police incompetence and by DPP failure to abide its own protocol, I think is a disgrace, and the fact that it was then continued because the two most senior judges of Victoria wrote a dreadful judgment, I think it's a cause for remorse for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Frank Brennan. We'll talk to you soon. Appreciate